Imagine this. It's just over a century ago. And crossing the ocean, the Black Waters, is a serious taboo for devout Hindus in India. Tradition strictly forbids it.
Right, a major cultural barrier.
But then, picture this scene. 1902, Maharaja Madho Singh II of Jaipur is getting ready to sail to London for King Edward VII's coronation.
Okay.
And he's not just going himself, he's bringing a whole herd of Indian cows with him.
Cows. For what?
For ritually pure milk. He wouldn't drink anything else. But, what was maybe even more astonishing, the thing that really makes this story stand out.
Well, he actually brought his family deity, Sri Gopalji, along for the ride.
The actual deity image.
Yes, it was quite an operation. They got a brand new steamer, the SS Olympia, had it specially customized.
Wow.
And get this, Brahmins went ahead and purified the entire ship.
Purified the ship itself.
And not just that, they packed 6 months' worth of water from the Ganga River.
India's sacred river.
Exactly, in huge silver urns. The idea was, he wouldn't have to drink a single drop of English water.
That level of preparation is just incredible. And the rituals, they didn't stop there, did they?
No. In Bombay, before setting sail, there was a whole second round of ceremonies, venerating the sea god.
And I read somewhere they were trying to copy the rituals of Rama, the epic hero.
That's the story, yeah. Following his protocol before he crossed the seas in the Ramayana, dropping gold, silver, rice, coconuts, flowers, milk onto the waves. It was pretty elaborate.
So what happened when they finally got to London? Must have caused a stir.
Oh, absolutely. The scene was just as remarkable. When the Maharaja left Victoria Station, Sri Gopalji's image was in the first carriage.
The god went first.
Yep, and Madho Singh followed behind it. Apparently, the sight caused, widespread public amazement. Newspapers were full of it, praising his devotion.
Huh. So by technically following his god, he kind of found this loophole, this clever way around the travel ban.
Precisely. A neat sidestep.
But the story gets even stranger, right? When King Edward got sick and the coronation was postponed.
Ah, yes, that's the kicker. According to the narrative that circulated, Madho Singh appealed day and night to Sri Gopalji.
To his Hindu god.
And supposedly, the deity magnanimously intervened and, restored the Christian king's health.
So the coronation happened because an Indian god stepped in.
That's the tale. If the crowning happened at all, it was thanks to Sri Gopalji.
That is such a captivating story. And it's just a perfect illustration, isn't it, of how ancient traditions can be, strategically interpreted, maybe, manipulated, to navigate those awkward spots between theory and reality.
Exactly.
So our first big takeaway here seems to be that India, as a civilization, has always kind of relied on these, what we call them, astute compromises, balancing tradition and modernity.
Absolutely. And that idea, that need for astute compromises, it goes way beyond just Madho Singh.
Yeah.
Look, India's sheer diversity, linguistic, ethnic, geographical, cultural, it's staggering.
Yeah.
To hold all that together required an incredible amount of, let's call it plasticity, a capacity to bend and adapt. Over 3 millennia, you see wave after wave of transformation.
You can really trace those shifts, can't you? From the early Vedic stuff, the fire altars, the sacrifices,
right,
to the rise of complex temple worship by, the end of the first millennium CE, the Puranic age?
That's right. And then you have encounters with completely new ways of thinking, like Buddhism and Jainism. They even drew away royal support for a time.
So each wave forced adaptation.
It did. And then, of course, Islam arrives, which posed a different kind of challenge altogether. It couldn't just be, ignored or easily absorbed like previous influences. Now, throughout all this, you find Brahmin texts often lamenting the state of things, the Kali Yuga, this corrupt cosmic age they felt they were in.
Right, the age of decline.
Yeah. But, despite the formal complaints, they adjusted every single time. They kept up this appearance of continuity while actually innovating quite actively behind the scenes.
It's fascinating how this adaptation seems baked in from the very beginning. Back in ancient times, as this sort of Indo-Aryan culture spread, it ran into all these incredibly diverse groups. And for the Brahmins promoting the Vedic religion, these outsiders were often labeled mlechas, barbarians. And that term was surprisingly broad, wasn't it? Even eating garlic could make you a mlecha.
Yes, it was quite flexible. And in fact, most of what we now call India was originally branded Mlecha Desa, barbarian country, a place where technically just visiting was a sin through the feet.
But they did go there, obviously.
Of course they did. In practice, the idea of Mlecha Desa shifted. It became less about geography and more conceptual. It meant a place where the Brahminical social and ritual order wasn't dominant yet.
Oh, okay.
So then it became the Brahmins' mission to, well, propagate their system, to transform these lands, make them receptive. And this led to this constant process, assimilation, sometimes elimination, consolidation, that started to sketch the outlines of what we now understand as Hinduism.
So it wasn't like a rigid blueprint being forced on everyone.
Yeah.
The orthodox Brahmin ideal, that four-caste system with Brahmins on top, that was often more theoretical, right? An aspiration.
Exactly. More often than not, that perfect fourfold division just didn't map onto the complex reality across most of India. So the story of Hinduism's emergence is really about these ongoing negotiations. Brahmins dealing with this bewildering variety of counterthoughts, alternative visions. Change is just fundamentally part of its DNA.
And you see this with the gods themselves. Older Vedic figures like Indra and Agni sort of fade.
Right, they recede.
And powerful new deities like Vishnu and Shiva come to the fore.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just replacement, was it? It was more like
A mix and match process.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Non-Vedic gods got merged with Vedic ones. Popular elements from other local traditions got pulled in. And it was all sort of dressed up in Brahminical theology.
Which brings us to the Puranas. These Sanskrit texts, put together by Brahmins, you're saying they were designed for this kind of flexibility, like a spiritual operating system that could keep getting updated.
They absolutely were. The Puranas employ this clever, flexible language. Someone called it an equivocal style. It allowed them to bring in new regional cults without directly contradicting the older stuff.
How did that work in practice?
Well, take Siva's family, for instance. That became a way to absorb local divinities, even animal gods like Ganapati, the elephant-headed one.
Oh, okay.
Vishnu's followers, meanwhile, used the idea of avatars' divine incarnations to pull in other regional gods. Think of the boar avatar, the man-lion avatar. These likely had local origins.
And even the Buddha got folded in eventually, despite the earlier opposition.
Yes, remarkably. As Buddhism declined in India, Brahmins eventually recast the Buddha himself as a deceptive avatar of Vishnu, sent to mislead the wicked.
Wow. So historical accuracy wasn't really the point.
Not at all. Look at the longest Purana, the Skanda Purana. It's famously called a scrap bag. If you found some old story nobody knew the source of, you can just say, oh, it's in the Skanda Purana. And get this, there were even Puranas on order during the colonial period. The Bhavavisha Purana, supposedly an ancient text predicting the future, mentions not just Muslim sultans, but also a certain Victavati.
Wait, Queen Victoria?
Queen Victoria herself, in an ancient prophecy.
That's amazing. So the Puranas became this fluid medium.
Exactly. Fluid. Not for tracking history precisely, but for weaving together the local and the pan-Indian, the new and the old. The goal was to universalize what was provincial, give local stuff a wider significance, while also embedding the big ideas into local contexts. It all got folded into this, admittedly rather cluttered, Sanskrit master narrative.
So in a way, Brahmanism was sort of conquered by the multitudes. It had to change its own shape as it absorbed all these diverse peoples and their gods through its gargantuan powers of assimilation.
That's a great way to put it. Its own success changed it.
Can you give us some concrete examples? How did this integration actually happen on the ground?
Sure. Let's see. There's the Chenchu tribe in Andhra Pradesh. They were brought into the fold through a myth about Vishnu falling in love with the Chenchu woman.
Okay. That's blunt.
Or look at the Ahom kings in northeast India. When they were Hinduized, the Brahmins accommodating them actually accepted their local left-handed worship practices involving liquor and meat, even for Brahminical deities.
Really? That seems like a big compromise.
It was. Then you have Ayanar, a local guardian deity in Tamil Nadu who got reimagined as Siva's son. And the Musahar community, a very marginalized group, saw their local deities recast as heroes from the Ramayana epic.
So it wasn't just about absorbing external gods, but also about adapting existing traditions, and even the Brahmins themselves changing.
Exactly. Brahmin groups themselves diversified enormously over time. You had vegetarian Brahmins living alongside meat-eating ones. Different burial customs emerged. Some Brahmin communities in places like Kerala even adopted matrilineal succession, tracing lineage through the mother.
That's a huge departure from the usual patriarchal norm.
It is, and they didn't just absorb gods, they absorbed people too. Tribal priests could sometimes be integrated. There's even a group called the Magha Brahmins, believed to be descended from ancient Iranian sun priests who were incorporated.
Wow. So Hinduism isn't really one single river, is it? It's more like a vast delta.
That's a perfect metaphor. A delta formed by countless streams, all connected, all flowing the same general direction, but each distinct. That's its real strength, this macro reality of organically united micro realities.
So not one book, not one single founder.
No. United more by shared myths, legends, and underlying principles told and retold in countless ways. Understanding this historical fluidity, this inherent adaptability, is just crucial for grasping how it transformed later on.
Okay, so we have this picture of immense fluidity, adaptability, assimilation. But did that mean everything was harmonious? Were there no internal conflicts bubbling up? Because it seems this era also saw the rise of bhakti, intense personal devotion, and a shift towards more human-like gods, temple worship.
That's a really important question. No, it wasn't all harmonious. The Puranic stories did help create this sense of a shared landscape, what scholars call a sacred geography.
How so?
Well, stories would link different physical temple sites together. Pilgrimage became a huge deal, a way for ordinary people to connect with the divine across vast distances. Like in Kurukshetra today, there's a banyan tree that supposedly marks the exact spot where Krishna delivered the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna.
Wow.
Or the myth of the Shakti Pithas, places where pieces of Shiva's wife Sati's body fell after her self-immolation. These spots, scattered across the subcontinent from Assam to Kashmir, became major pilgrimage centers linked by this one powerful narrative.
And this process fostered a kind of culture of commonality, didn't it? Even with different languages and local histories. It leads to that phrase we still hear, unity in diversity.
It certainly contributed to that feeling, yes. But, and this is a big but, this grand narrative definitely had its critics. Dissent was always there.
Like who?
Well, take the Veersaiva movement in Karnataka, starting around the 12th century. They actively rejected elaborate temple worship. Instead, each believer carried a small personal symbol of Siva, an Ishtalingam.
Interesting.
And their followers included people often excluded from mainstream temple culture, washermen, barbers, sex workers, even reformed burglars, apparently.
So pushing back against the established structures.
Absolutely. Their leading voice, Basava, had this incredibly powerful critique of building grand temples. He said something like, "The rich will make temples for Siva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold."
Listen, O Lord, things standing shall fall, but the moving shall ever stay.
That's beautiful and profound.
It really is a direct challenge to the permanence and hierarchy of the temple system, favoring inner personal devotion.
So this wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It was a real pushback, often from the margins. Precisely. And the internal conflicts went beyond just dissent. They were just as significant, sometimes more so, than any external pressures. It wasn't always this neat unity and diversity. Feubs were common.
Between different groups.
Yes, and even between followers of the main gods, Shiva and Vishnu. You'd find Saiva poets writing stories where Vishnu is clearly shown as subordinate to Siva, and then Vaishnavas would write tales doing the exact opposite, portraying Siva as basically Vishnu's appointee.
So sectarian rivalry,
Yeah.
trying to establish dominance.
Right. But the attitude towards other ascetic traditions, particularly Jains and Buddhists, was often harsher. The aim there wasn't just subordination, it was often framed as needing to vanquish them completely.
Why the difference?
Because Jains and Buddhists fundamentally rejected core Brahminical ideas, the authority of the Vedas, the caste system itself. From a Brahminical perspective, they were seen as, well, more alien than competing Hindu sects.
And did these conflicts sometimes turn violent?
Oh, definitely. History is littered with examples. In the 12th century, a royal succession dispute in Andhra involved rival Saiva and Vaishnava groups backing different claimants.
Okay.
In 1598, you had Saiva priests dramatically jumping off a temple tower in protest against what they saw as the excessive promotion of Vishnu worship.
Wow.
And as late as 1789, armed ascetics, Vaishnava and Saiva monks actually fought each other over who got to bathe first during a major festival.
Armed monks fighting.
Yes. And even our Maharaja from the beginning, Madhu Singh of Jaipur. In the 1860s, after declaring allegiance to Saivism, he launched a campaign of oppression against Vaishnava merchants and temples in his own kingdom.
It's quite a turbulent picture.
Yeah.
And then there's the famous Tirupati temple controversy.
Ah, yes, Tirupati.
Yeah.
Huge debates raged for centuries about whether the main deity was fundamentally Shiva or Vishnu. People pointed to features. Does he have matted hair like Shiva or hold a conch and discuss like Vishnu? They actually had to invent new Puranic stories just to explain away the features that didn't fit the preferred identity.
So even the identity of major gods in major temples was contested.
deeply contested. And this impulse to claim or reclaim sacred spaces even extended to converting sites originally belonging to Jains and Buddhists.
Such as?
Well, a prominent temple in Nagercoil, down south, used to be a Jain shrine. Kings in the Deccan regions actively converted Buddhist cave shrines at Ellora, even chiseling out Buddha images to install Hindu deities.
Right.
Lord Curzon, the British viceroy, was apparently quite startled in 1903 to find the main temple at Bodh Gaya, the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, under the control of Saiva priests.
Bodh Gaya itself.
Yes, and estimates suggest that perhaps as many as 2,000 Jain sites in Karnataka alone were destroyed or repurposed into Hindu temples during the late medieval period.
2,000. That's a staggering number. And the accounts from the time sound pretty brutal.
They can be. Saiva hagiographies, lives of saints, sometimes boastfully describe their heroes uprooting and shattering Jain idols, calling them dolls, and killing thousands of Jains. Tamil poetry from the period even includes lines calling for the theft of Buddha images. Goodness.
And maybe most disturbingly, some Tamil temple processions, even up until about a century ago, apparently featured images depicting a Jain impaled on a stake.
That's chilling. So, outright triumphalism and violence. But you also mentioned compromise earlier. Did that happen too?
Yes, it wasn't always destruction. Sometimes the enmity was tamed into compromise, as the source puts it. For instance, the Basava Purana, that important Virasaiva text, has stories that critique Brahminical pride. One portrays Brahmins as the real untouchables. Another tells of a dog reciting the Vedas perfectly, just to deflate Brahmin arrogance. It's a kind of symbolic reversal.
Okay. So alongside this incredible fluidity and assimilation, we have these deep internal tensions, sectarian rivalries, philosophical critiques, and even outright violence. It's a much more complex picture. And then into this already complex mix comes another major force, Islam, which arrived in India through very different routes, didn't it, with different initial impacts. Yes, that's a key point. You have two main points of entry, broadly speaking. Down south, in Kerala on the west coast, the entry was relatively peaceful.
Peaceful? How so?
Well, local legends developed, like the story of a Chera king, who supposedly saw the moon miraculously split a sign associated with the Prophet Muhammad and converted to Islam. This kind of tale helped legitimize both the local Hindu dynasties and create a space for the arriving Muslim communities to integrate quite smoothly into the regional culture.
Okay, so myth-making eased the way.
In a sense, yes, but contrast that with North India. There, Islam primarily arrived via conquest through battlefields. Mahmud of Ghazna's raids on the Somnath temple in the 11th century are the classic example.
Right, Somnath. That gets mentioned a lot.
It does, and while Somnath was just one of many temples raided, its destruction was really amplified in Arabic and Persian chronicles. It was portrayed, especially for foreign audiences, as the Mecca of idolatry, making Mahmud seem like this great champion of Islam, the bane of infidels. It set a kind of narrative standard.
So in the north, Islam was perceived very differently from the start, more as an adversary.
By some, certainly. It came to be seen in certain narratives as a devourer of Hindus, a kind of civilizational adversary. So the responses to Islam became this kind of strange combination of acceptance and rejection, a real seesaw.
And presumably, a big challenge for the Brahmin intellectuals was figuring out how to fit Muslims into their existing worldview, their Puranic universe.
Exactly. It was difficult because Islam arrived in many ways pre-packaged with its own distinct theology, laws, and history rooted in Arabia and Persia. Plus, its core message of egalitarianism directly conflicted with the hierarchical caste system. It wasn't easily absorbed.
So this led to competing narratives.
It did. On both sides, elites developed their own stories. Hindu court poets would portray their kings as incarnations of Vishnu, destined to quell the chaos brought by these foreign militias. Muslim court historians, conversely, depicted their sultans as pious defenders of the faith, battling the enemies of Islam.
A clash of narratives.
Definitely. Yet, once Islamic political power became established, practical compromises were unavoidable. Sultans often had to rule over majority Hindu populations. So you see things like sultans issuing coins with Sanskrit inscriptions alongside Arabic or Persian ones. Policies of tolerance were often necessary, even if just for pragmatic reasons.
And it's those complexities, those contradictions, that are so striking, aren't they? You mentioned Tipu Sultan earlier.
Ah, Tipu.
Yeah.
A perfect example. In his home territories in Mysore, he was known to patronize Hindu temples and maths. But when he campaigned in Kerala, he gained a reputation as a terror, destroying temples and forcing conversions.
So different personas in different contexts.
Exactly. Or look at Shivaji, the celebrated Maratha warrior king. He's often portrayed in later narratives as an avatar of Vishnu, specifically sent to destroy unruly Muslims.
Right.
Yet his own father, Shahaji, was reportedly named after a Muslim Sufi saint, Shah Sharif. It just shows how layered identities were back then. It wasn't simple.
And were there positive interactions too? Constructive exchanges?
Oh, absolutely. You find accounts of Muslim nobles in the Deccan seeking guidance from Hindu gurus. Syncretic cults emerged, like that of Satyapir, which blended Hindu and Muslim symbols and practices.
Satyapir, right.
There were stories of miracle-working Hindu figures raised by Muslims. Certain local deities, like Khandoba in Maharashtra, attracted devotion from Muslims as well as Hindus.
So shared sacred spaces and figures.
Yes. And some Brahmins even tried to create Puranic origins for Islam itself, suggesting, for instance, that the Prophet Muhammad descended from Vishnu or that Shiva had given him permission to start a new religion.
Seriously, trying to fit Islam into the Puranic framework.
They tried. And think of Emperor Akbar in the 16th century. He famously hosted religious debates, celebrated Hindu festivals like Diwali and Holi at his court, commissioned translations of Sanskrit epics like the Mahabharata into Persian.
And some Brahmas apparently even compared him to a deity, right?
They did, composing hymns in his honor. And even at Somnath, the site of those famous raids, local Muslims reportedly used to pay their respects there before heading off on the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca.
So Islam was clearly different, but maybe not inexpressibly alien, as the author puts it, because India itself was already so diverse.
Precisely. That inherent diversity perhaps made accommodating difference, even radical difference, somewhat easier than it might have been elsewhere. And remember, Hindus used us and them language against other Hindus too, different castes, different sects.
So before the modern era, identity wasn't primarily Hindu versus Muslim. It was much more complex: caste, region, language, sect, all layered together.
That's a really crucial point to grasp. However, and this is also important, we shouldn't swing too far the other way and say the religious divide was purely artificial or just a colonial invention.
Yeah.
That's too simplistic as well. Because even if daily life involved lots of mixing and compromise, at an intellectual level, among the elites at least, distinct notions of us and them based on religion did persist. Both Muslim and Hindu scholars and writers articulated these differences.
And there was real conflict too, not just theoretical differences.
Absolutely. There was no shortage of violence and polemics that reveal those underlying tensions. For example, historical records mention Muslims being killed during Eid prayers in Haryana in 1244 after an attack by Hindus. A mosque in Kerala was reportedly attacked simply because its builders dared to tile the roof, seen as claiming equality with a nearby temple. Shrines were set ablaze in Kashmir during conflicts. And there's a particularly vivid description from a poet in the early 1400s detailing how Turkish rulers allegedly coerced Brahmins, broke their sacred threads, destroyed temples, and built mosques in their place.
So those kinds of encounters, those narratives of conflict, they existed too.
They did. These were the ingredients, if you like, that could support a binary view, that could potentially alert Hindus to a sense of political oneness based on shared vulnerability or opposition. The potential was there.
Which brings us then to the final and perhaps most transformative encounter, the arrival of European powers. And with them, politically backed Christianity.
Yes. This was different again. When the first Jesuits, like Rodolfo Acquaviva, arrived at Akbar's court in the late 16th century, they came with high hopes, full of wishful thinking, as the source says, about converting the emperor himself.
But Akbar wasn't interested in converting, was he? He was more interested in learning.
Exactly. They found his open-mindedness and intellectual curiosity deeply frustrating. They called it fickleness. He explored multiple faiths, but committed to none in the way they wanted.
And the story of Acquaviva's death is quite telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
About the misunderstandings.
It really is. Here he was enjoying relative safety and intellectual respect at the heart of the Mughal Empire at Akbar's court. But then he goes down to Portuguese-controlled Goa, apparently plants a cross where a Hindu temple had been destroyed.
Oh dear.
And he's hacked to death by an angry Hindu mob. It just starkly highlights the massive cultural chasm and the potential for violence when sensitivities were ignored.
And generally, how did these early Europeans view Hindu practices?
Well, often through, let's say, jaundiced eyes. Many reports, especially from missionaries who needed to raise funds back home, tended to exaggerate the exotic and the heathenish. Stereotypes got recycled and amplified.
Like what kind of stereotypes?
Think back to Marco Polo's descriptions of Devadasis, the female temple servants. Centuries later, European illustrators who'd never been to India would depict them looking like European nuns dancing before idols that resembled Catholic saints.
No kidding.
Yeah. And Hindu deities with multiple arms or animal features, they were often just retrofitted, as the author says, into existing medieval European categories of monsters and devils.
So they weren't trying to understand them on their own terms.
Not really. Figures like Vishnu in his Narasimha man-lion form, or multi-headed deities, were described in lurid terms monstrous devils, things resembling creatures from the Book of Revelation.
And what about practices like sati, widow burning? That features heavily in European accounts.
It does. Sati and also exaggerated tales of chariot suicides where devotees supposedly threw themselves under the wheels of temple chariots during festivals. These were often sensationalized and misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted how?
Well, one bizarrely common explanation for sati in European texts was that it was invented to stop wives from poisoning their elderly husbands, which clearly says more about European anxieties about women than about Indian reality. But these kinds of lurid details became essential ingredients in travelogues, and crucially, they served a purpose. They helped justify the British Raj's own quest to civilize India. See? We need to rule them to stop these barbaric practices.
Right, the civilizing mission argument.
Exactly. And alongside that, you often find these rather prurient fantasies projected onto Hindu women, tales of secret networks for illicit affairs, ritual deflowering by priests or idols, and of course, constant shock and disapproval expressed about naked ascetics, the sadhus.
So a lot of judgment, misunderstanding, and projection, which leads us to the term Hinduism itself. That wasn't originally an Indian term, was it?
No, it wasn't. It first appeared as a label used by outsiders Persians, then Europeans, basically as a catch-all geographical and cultural term for the diverse peoples and traditions they encountered beyond the Indus River.
But it wasn't just imposed, right? The text says Hindus seized that expression, recognizing something familiar there.
That's a really important nuance. Hinduism wasn't simply invented by the colonizers in the modern era. The name itself might be relatively modern, yes, but the river is old. The term Hinduism represents, in this view, the latest milestone in a long-running religious process of definition and adaptation. But that sustained and often painful interaction with the colonial West, with its power, its critiques, its relentless categorization, that did lead to a kind of hastened stitching up of its outer borders.
A sticking up. What does that mean?
It means Hindus began to define themselves more sharply against the outside world. They started seeing themselves reflected in this mirror crafted by foreign hands, as the author beautifully puts it, and the reflection was often somewhat distorted.
But they weren't just passively accepting that reflection.
No, absolutely not. Native minds were not blank slates. This encounter sparked what's called native agency. It prompted intense internal debates, reforms, soul-searching, as well as external resistance.
So the result was something new, but built on the old.
Exactly, a kind of hybrid, still old in many respects, drawing on those deep traditions we've discussed, but also renewed and repackaged in a way to survive the modern world. It involved selectively using parts of the Western critique while rejecting others, finding parallels within Hindu traditions, and emphasizing certain aspects over others.
And this process had profound political consequences, didn't it?
It really did. Colonialism, the experience of being ruled and often denigrated by a foreign power, seeded a feeling among many Hindus that their identity needed muscle.
Yeah.
It needed to be stronger, more unified, more assertive.
Forging a kind of defensive frame.
Yes. And in creating that defensive frame, they often position themselves not just against the Western colonizers, but also, increasingly, against Muslims within India, who were sometimes seen as another other linked to past conquests. This dynamic fed directly into the rise of modern Hindu nationalism.
Which some see as an aberration, right? The departure from Hinduism's historical fluidity and diversity.
Exactly. Critics see it as hardening the boundaries, imposing a uniformity that betrays Hinduism's pluralistic past. But for its more militant advocates, this kind of consolidation, this regimentation, is viewed as absolutely essential for survival and strength in the modern, often competitive world.
So that really brings us full circle. This deep dive, it hasn't really been about, abstract philosophy or theology in isolation.
No, not at all. It's been an investigation into human action and reaction. How people, communities, traditions respond to huge historical forces like political conquest, cultural encounters, domination, and resistance.
And it really underscores how the history of Hinduism, this constantly adapting, incorporating, sometimes conflicting, many-layered phenomenon challenges our easy, simplistic ideas about what a religion or a religious identity is.
Absolutely. It's far more complex